Hi there. Today on Lydia's Books, I want to talk about 6 classic horror novels that I will never part with. These will be on my shelf forever and ever. Amen. They have gorgeous yellowed spines, except this little greeny one, a little bit of a reddish hue to this one, and some you could probably guess. If you could guess, step back and guess, what are the 6 books that you think are missing from that shelf right there? Then that's what these are. I mean, here's a little bit of a giveaway. Hell House. Of course, that's going to be on the list. Now, I have talked about all of these books tangentially, at least directly, perhaps, like Hell House. And I mean, it goes without saying that is one of my top favorite classic horror stories that shaped me as a writer, as a horror fan, and just as a book lover, because as a kid I gravitated to the horror section, like I'm sure a lot of you did too, in used bookstores. Sure, there was the Anne McCaffrey stuff, and I did like the UFO section and a little bit of the true crime, but I went to the horror section first and last. And these are books that I've picked up over the years. The last one I'll talk about is a newish addition to my stacks, but it's a book that I've wanted for quite some time, and I didn't read it right away either, but some of these I picked up years and years and years and years ago at either Allison's Books in North Bay, Ontario, or there was a little bookstore, which I can't remember the name of, that was right beside my house for a long time as a young adult. I've done a lot of shopping here at Black Squirrel Books or the library sales, but I'm pretty sure all of these but one came from North Bay, Ontario, when I was like young. Between the ages of maybe 15 and 25 is when these books were procured. So yes, these are beautiful classic horror books. A lot of them have been adapted into films. Nay, all of them, save one, have been adapted into films, and we will get to that. Before I do, I will say these are books, like I said, that shaped me as a writer as well. I kind of strive to write one of these sorts of books. Go back to basics, classic horror haunting, whether it be ghosts or a haunted house or a possessed place, whatever, but with a modern twist. And at the time, these were modern horror stories, right? We were moving out of gothic tales. We were moving out of the creature features, and these were modern stories. Now, there is a huge boom in modern folk horror right now and things like that, or of course the sci-fi horror blends, and that's not necessarily what I mean. It is more like taking modern contrivances and not shoehorning them into an old trope, but how those old tropes and conventions would interact in our modern world. I mean, sure, some people in this stack went on to write kind of sci-fi stuff that would be labeled sci-fi at the time, but now it is just kind of modern horror, and we forget that it was at one time / science fiction. So I would love to be able to write something like these. You may go back and look at these books and say, you know what, they're not really well written. This one has too many exclamation points. It's kind of hokey jokey, or they're relying on conventions that are like not very politically correct these days. That's the foible of it, right? You want to be able to write this modern horror and you're not worried or thinking about what it's going to sound like in 20 years. I would love to be able to forge ahead and write this sort of new horror fiction. I think this is why people are gravitating to some authors that use modern contrivances coupled with a new twist on really great horror stories. You've got Todd Kiesling stuff, Paul Tremblay stuff, Adam Caesar stuff, really working well in the now. Katrina Ward, Sina Paleo, they have a lot of, playing with old ideas in horror set in a very chic, normal, modern world that we can all relate to. So I think that's why people are really gravitating to those sorts of authors nowadays, because they're telling these sorts of stories. If you've not read these books, I highly recommend them all. I'm no doubt you've seen the films if you're a film fan. If you're one of those people who films are a little too scary for you and you're newish to horror, it's great to go back to some of these older books. So starting with Hull House by Richard Matheson. I've talked about my copy in such horrible disrepair and I've not replaced it yet. I am so sorry. 1971 Hull House. It makes for an amazing film as well, but this is the sort of haunted house story that kept me up at night. The modern twist found in this is that they're using machines to sort of tease out the ghosts. This is pre-Ghostbusters, right? So they're using these huge machines to detect and trap a ghost. I really love that angle in this, and it kind of tied into my love of using huge machines and scientists in the paranormal and occult ghost hunting, like the film The Entity. Now, Hull House, of course, is the Belasco house. A team of investigators is invited to investigate the haunting of the most haunted house in the world, and many psychics have already died doing just the same. There is one that is included in this group that had survived the previous onslaught against psychics that investigated this house, alongside these scientists and other psychic mediums and physical mediums that are brought to the house. And the book is a little more hokey jokey than the very serious film. You could look back at the ending of this story and think that it is also a little hokey as well. But at the time, you know, this sort of mechanical ruse, a mechanical use of things to persist in the afterlife, went hand in hand, I think, with Egyptology and the craze of Egyptology at the time. So yeah, it was a very fun read for me as a kid. I loved this book. It even does have sort of spicy scenes that are a little bit awkward, and I liked that it didn't go over the top in sexuality. Richard Matheson's Hull House, one of the great novels of the occult, the Belasco house. Some people called it the most haunted of haunted houses. It was said that demons stalked the ancient rooms and that rites of black magic and the most perverse sexual crimes had been enacted there. I think that the stories that are told in here over dinner about what went on in this house really set the stage more so than the actual hauntings itself. That the ghosts played havoc with the minds and souls of visitors who passed a night in the old main mansion. Twice, teams of psychic investigators had examined the place. None escaped unscathed. Suicide, insanity, grotesque, horrifying death followed each exploration. Now a new team was going to exorcise the dark spirits of Hull House. So yeah, you can see how this would capture the imagination of a very young teen Lydia. I, again, was like 15 or so when I discovered this, maybe younger. Absolutely love this book. Always will, always will. And this is not in order of age or preference necessarily. Sort of in order of how highly influential these books are to me. So on to the next one, number 2. The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson, a true story. It says, oh my. I think that the myth of this house preceded itself to me. Having heard of the film, having heard of the book, my mom and grandmother talked about occultism and things like that freely, and horror stories and old horror stories. And this one was on the shelf for the longest time while I was a bit too young to read it. And I didn't really know what it was about, but I would ask and they would tell me. So I had like maybe a kid's version of this, The Most Haunted House Ever. And this has really stuck with me. And laugh if you will. Like, I kind of love the idea that the Amityville house itself has persisted as this thing. You can take one of these colonial houses, give it eye windows, call it the Amityville whatever, and it works for me. I mean, well, they don't all work. There's a lot of garbage in that Amityville pile, but I am instantly drawn to the idea of an Amityville horror house. Now, this was presented as a true account. Now, you have the crossover with the apparent haunting, the apparent hoax, a lot of the things like the horrible tragedy that took place in the actual house. The story itself, as it has come out year by year, is more and more fictionalized as we go on. So I include it here not as a true story, but as a horror story. It is a haunted house story because I always think of it as a fictional horror story written by a horror author, Jay Anson, right? I mean, I have an adaptation later on, The Ghosts of Amityville by Hans Holzer, and it's not good, right? But I hang on to it because it is an important thing, because he did investigate the house as a researcher, and Jay Anson investigated the house as a fiction writer, right? So I really love this story so much. This book has been on my shelf for a very long time, and I've read it a couple times. I really want to read it again soon, though, because I mean, it's just fitting, it's just perfect. And I think that this sort of writing is what I would really like to be able to do with the twists and turns and the people that do come into the house. The fact that they can seem to be able to come and go from the house at will, although it is so terrifyingly haunted, not unlike the Belasco house. I mean, yeah, love this. These aren't all haunted house books, by the way, either. In December 1975, I was born in December 1975. Maybe that's another reason why I love this so much. 28 Days of Terror in a House Possessed by Evil Spirits. In December 1975, the Letts family moved into their dream home, the same home where Ronald DeFeo had murdered his parents, brothers and sisters, just 1 year earlier. The psychic phenomena that followed created the most terrifying experience for the Letts family had ever experienced, forcing them to flee the house in 28 days, convinced it was possessed by evil spirits. Now, say what you will about a few things with this book, where maybe Jay Anson smelt money, the Lutzes smelt money. Who knows? Like, I wasn't there. I was a baby. And this book came out in 1977. I was still a baby. And by the time I got this very popularized, where it was almost like the stuff of schoolyard mythology, where I heard about the story well before I read the actual book or understood the true nature of the story, like everything that I read right there is basically true. If you take the idea that there is a hoax involved out of it, they, moved into a house a murder had been committed in and paranormal exploits ensued. So yeah, terrifying. It also has that minuscule trope, which isn't really a big thing within this, about the land that the house is on. Later books definitely explore that, and then I think it gives rise to something like Toby Hooper's Poltergeist, where they didn't move the bodies, the whole Indian burial ground trope, where we didn't realize the entire planet is an Indian burial ground when you think about it. And the only actually horrific true story Indian burial grounds that I have heard about recently are residential schools, right? So there is a very insensitive lens, but of course it is that weird white guilt of having stolen the land and having the ancestors and the rightful owners of the lands rise up against them paranormally. So it is rooted in that terrible white guilt. We get that white settler guilt in a number of horror tropes, and I guess that we have, guilt to thank for a lot of that, as we do with other books that are kind of come out, some sort of different kinds of guilt. That isn't like the most major focus of this book, but there is a religious horror angle of this book that is often forgotten, kind of calling to the Christian church to come and help cleanse the house, and what horrors ensue after that, with having nuns in the family that don't want to spend time in this, having a priest come to cleanse the house, and that doesn't go very well at all. That sort of angle is always sort of flushed out of this book because people are focused so much on the hoax nature or some of the other non-PC things that are within this book. But for the most part, it's just a fairly brilliant haunted story. If the true story had never happened or we weren't aware of it, this would be like one of the best haunted house stories ever. So that's why I've included it here, and I will never ever part with this book. I come back to the idea of the white flight in a lot of my talks about horror. And it is one of those, maybe a guilt thing, where a lot of people left the city for the country and they've encroached upon this country idol. And that's where you get some hillbilly horror was inspired by this, because there was a lot of city people going into places where they didn't know, understand, or belong. And at the same end, maybe this is part of the Amityville story too, is that they also left behind a lot of this cheap real estate in the cities. So you get these great big old houses on the cheap, or, something terrible happened. People don't want to necessarily move there because they're all moving to the country. They're going to move into these old manor houses or houses with a sordid past. And maybe that is part of what is going on with the Stepford Wives story, is that they want to escape to the country, but not that far to the country. So they choose the quiet suburb. And it's that liminal space in between the countryside where they don't belong and shouldn't go, and the city, which is full of madmen and insanity and cheap houses for the Lutzes to move into. Both Ira Levin books. Now, we'll talk about Rosemary's Baby first. Ira Levin's career actually spanned a very long time. This is near the beginning of his career, 1967. A lot older than I really think it is. I always think of this as like a late 70s thing, probably due to the film. It's very famous because of the film. Now, it was a bestseller in its time, and of course became a huge success as a film. But yeah, horror, scary, a religious horror, cult horror, pregnancy horror. It's really got it all. And the modern angle in this, of course, is that change that was happening in women's liberation. They suddenly sewed pockets in all of their clothes again and had money to run away and do whatever they liked. They had birth control in the most grand sense of the term, where they could control the caregiving of the child, control whether they return to the workforce, control what sort of medical procedures they would have during, or medical care during pregnancy, or whether to continue a pregnancy at all. And that is like things that fueled this. So I think that this really is built on a lot of like maybe man's guilt of having put women in a position for so long on one hand to have not had pockets in their clothing and not be able to make these sorts of decisions. And suddenly with all these decisions thrust on them, what else could go wrong? Satan, that's what could go wrong. Cults, other people controlling in another way when it's not the husband, who in this case is a bit of a cardboard cutout to say the least. It's everyone else around him too, right? He's not so great in the first place, but the whole building, the whole city, it seems, wants to control the birth of Rosemary's Baby. Suppose you were an up-to-date young wife who moved into an old and elegant New York apartment house with a rather strange past. Suppose that only after you became pregnant did you begin to suspect the building harbored a diabolically evil group of devil worshippers who had mastered the arts of black magic and witchcraft. Suppose that the satanic conspiracy set out to claim not only your husband but your baby. Well, that's what happened to Rosemary. Or did it? I think that "or did it" really leads into The Son of Rosemary. Like, I really love Ira Levin's work. I haven't read absolutely all of it, but I shall. I own, I think, absolutely all of it. But Son of Rosemary is not my favorite. I have an old video where I rant, basically. It's my only slam video. I've alluded to it before. I've talked about it often. It's not my favorite book, but that little line really happened to Rosemary, or did it? And some of the ending where things sort of calm down to a sense of normalcy, the "or did it" really does lead into Son of Rosemary, which I do have my doubts sometimes that he even wrote that book. It does, I guess, work with this reluctantly. It retcons a whole lot of it, which is a travesty because this is a nearly perfect horror story. It's not a haunted house. It's not a ghost. It is a psychological cult type of horror, something that's become very popular in the last few days with the rise of, more modern cults, the rise of documentary filmmaking and podcastia with books and podcasts like Cultish. I think that stories like this have become more and more horrific because they're a lot more tangible. It's not a high fantasy horror story that could only take place outside of Central Park in New York, right? It could happen anywhere. And I think that that's been impressed upon us since this come out. So it has a lot of staying power. And again, it has a film. Like all of these books, except one, really have a film about it. And if you are not into reading old, clunky, if you think it's clunky horror classics, then the film may be for you. If you've missed any of these, definitely check them out. They really are award-winning masterpieces of horror storytelling. Number 4 is another Ira Levin. He really is a master of horror, maybe not talked about quite as often as he ought to be. The Stepford Wives. Another modern story about perhaps the guilt that men feel for the control of women for so long and what happens when they sort of relinquish that And it's not any fault of these very strong and wonderful women who definitely pass the Bechdel test sometimes in this book. But it's the other forces around them that are seeking to control them en masse. And in this, it's not even the men, it's the fellow women themselves as well that are working with this course of control against one woman to sort of have her become part of the flock. With the real rise of this tradwife movement, hashtag tradwife, I think that this fits really well into that sort of horror storytelling. So if you're looking to see where a lot of the fear, and if you've thought that this would make a good horror story, what's going on sometimes in that sort of stratosphere of the internet, then definitely go back and take a look at Stepford Wives, where it kind of all began in a way. It's weird because this is kind of doing double duty, like which is scary, to be the modern woman out there, untethered, or to be a controlled robot, as it were. It's 1984. Of course, women have had pockets in their clothing for some time now, and Ira Levin is reinventing himself, which he will do time and time again. It's not on the list here because it's not one of my favorite books, but it's also a film, Sliver, which was quite modern and relied on the surveillance culture and surveillance state and a sick madman who can surveil you as well. But this, of course, is a town. Hank Scorpio from The Simpsons has a town based on Stepford itself. And there are little communities here and there which are appealing to me in a way, because it's sort of like adult themed, cozy bungalows, quiet little grassy strips, your white picket fence and everything, and community gardens. It all sounds so good, but in the back of my mind, I think of this book and I wonder and I worry. When Joanna Eberhardt and her husband Walter moved to the quiet suburb of Stepford, she thought they had left behind the dangers of the crime-ridden city. This is also right after the white flight kind of thing where everyone moved out of the cities for the country. Joanna felt safe now. Stepford seems like such a pleasant town. Then, little by little, dark suspicions began to blacken the bright picture. Stepford wasn't just another quiet little town, not at all. There was an evil secret hidden in Stepford, a secret Joanna was almost afraid to guess. Yes, it is a fiendishly terrifying and kind of sci-fi book for the time, where now we understand a little bit more about coercive control and cult behaviors and programming. At the time, maybe we didn't quite as much. We did a little bit, but not the way that we do in depth now, where all those layers are sort of peeled back, and it's maybe not as terrifying. At the time, this would have been so much more, right? So yeah, highly, highly recommend reading this. The film is really great too, and it is a good kind of gateway to horror. If you want a thriller that's a little bit more terrifying, a little bit more real, and you're not into like paranormal, supernatural sorts of things, this is sort of like a good straddling the line between horror and sci-fi. I recently watched Companion, which reminded me of this as well. So if you've enjoyed some of those more modern stories like that, or Megan, maybe something like that, this might also be a good counterpart to that if you've missed some of these classic tales. That brings us to book number 5, the oldest book on the list, 1959. This is Psycho by Robert Bloch. He was writing it apparently in 1957, 1958, around the same time that Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainsfield, did commit murders. I also have read that he took only a few weeks to write this book. So which is it? Was it being worked on for a long time? Did it take a few weeks? Or he like me and writes almost a whole book and outlines it and then lets it sit for 2 years before actually finishing it? Or 10 years, who knows? But yes, this is a book that needs no real introduction. Psycho by Robert Bloch. I love this book so much, and it differs so much from the film. If you've not read Psycho, I've talked about it before briefly here and there on other videos on my channel, but if you've not read Psycho and only seen the film, definitely pick this up. The character of Norman Bates is absolutely completely different. A very, very different kind of person than the Anthony Perkins star of the Hitchcock film, which is a wonderful film. All the other remakes are very good as well. You know, it's not Psycho I don't think. But yeah, the book itself is really what reigns supreme to me. Now, it is extremely short too, so if you've not read it, then why not? It's only going to take you an afternoon to get through. I love this exact edition as well. It's a old pocket book. It is a Crest book. I think this is a British imprint. 35 cents it says. Imagine if books were really that inexpensive. I absolutely love this little tiny binding. It's lasted for a very long time. I've had this book since I was probably about 19 years old. And yeah, just a perfect little edition. The sort of thing that I would have bought for $1 in a used bookstore. I don't even know what it would cost now to replace it exactly. I'm having trouble still replacing my Hell House. Motel, vacancy. The sign was unlit. The motel was dark. She switched off the ignition and waited. All at once she could hear the sullen patter of the rain and sense the sigh of the wind behind it. So we know the story. If you've seen the film, Marion Crane is a worker, a receptionist, a secretary, going to do some banking for her boss, and she gets distracted and kind of runs off with the money. It's not a spoiler. This happens in the very first few seconds. And she goes on a little cross-country adventure, ends up at Bates Motel, where things unfurl. The owner of the Bates Motel now is Norman Bates and his mother. They have not had a lot of business because of the highway going through. Now you can see how this book really inspired so many other horror stories. And I'm not the first to draw parallels, of course, between this and things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and other books where city life has passed by these other small pockets. This is that story of the desperation that takes hold when somebody is isolated and when the world has passed them by entirely. And I found that more so than the story of Ed Gein, which is very different. And in interviews with Robert Bloch, he'll point out time and time again how, Norman Bates didn't do the things that Ed Gein did. And Ed Gein never owned a hotel, and Norman Bates wasn't much of a hunter. That sort of parallel just is not there. I think the biggest parallel between them is the corpses, but I mean, that's not unique either when you really think about it, unfortunately. But this one does have a lot of parallels with the men and boys who were taken by men's adventure things and war stories. So there is a lot of setup in the beginning of this talking about Norman Bates and his fixation with stories of far off places and the cannibal stories and stories of war and terror and killing and occult practices, some of the darker corners of humanity that were starting to hit the newsreels in the 50s, right? Because it is a story of the modernity crossing paths with this isolation and the sort of bad seed idea of what Norman was, left to his own devices and his imagination fueled by things like constant taxidermy. That was his only real friend in the house, were stuffed dead birds and animals, and these stories from overseas that were raucous and probably banned kind of fiction that he'd been filling his head with. Psycho was a modern tale at the time, in a way, of a modern type man that had been twisted by isolation and these imaginations while the modern world is passing him by, which may have offered some sort of help. I really, really love this story. It is, again, really, really short if you've only seen the film. And if you want to read something that had launched 1,000 ships, so to speak, in the horror universe, Psycho can't be beat. And the new edition, and the reason this isn't a top 5 but a top 6, is Black Christmas by Thomas Altman. Oh my God. He spent time in both Ireland and the States. Campbell Black was another name that he wrote under. His actual name was Thomas Campbell Black. He wrote as Thomas Altman, Jeffrey Campbell, Campbell Black, a lot of different names for whatever reason. And he wrote quite a few other books, mostly thrillers, and only really 2 horror stories. What's odd, I think, about Black Christmas is that people look at this, and even having a screaming woman in a black Christmas ball sort of look reminds you of the film Black Christmas, which has nothing to do with this. Completely different story. Black Christmas, the film, is a story about sorority girls in a sorority house with a madman that keeps calling them on the phone. This is not that at all. This is a completely different story of a small town in upstate New York that is sort of dealing with the cold weather around Christmas, a lot of snow, a lot of snowmobiles, and the sheriff is on the trail of a sadistic killer that is murdering people and leaving clues for him to find around the town. And there are some stakes, his girlfriend is involved. Her ex is in the picture. I mean, it's got sort of those thriller tropes because he was a thriller writer, first and foremost, but it works really well. And I really like when there is high tension, high stakes horror. It's not a haunted house. It's not a ghost. It's another killer, which I really do like. We've gone from paranormal to just madmen here. And yeah, this one is very interesting to me. It took me a long time to get to it. I keep thinking that I picked this up at Apport Books because I pick up a lot of my old used horror from Apport used books and a lot of my favorite, most expensive collectible horror too when I think about it. But this was found in the Long Lac Public Library at one point. So that's up north here. I must have picked this up at Allison's used books at some point, but it took me a long time to get to reading it. I read it 2 years ago for Christmas and really, really enjoyed it. I don't know why I had avoided it. Maybe it was that leftover strangeness of knowing that this wasn't the movie, so therefore it must not be as good if the movie was not written about this book. This is the only book in the stack that doesn't have a film made after it, but it does have a film that is often mistaken for it. What's interesting about Thomas Altman as an author is that he seemed to pick titles that were either really generic and used a lot in horror later, or he lifted them from other properties, because he has things called Kiss Daddy Goodbye, and there's a film called Kiss Daddy Goodbye that is not based on his book. He has things called The Intruder. There's films and other books probably called The Intruder that are not based on his book whatsoever. The True Bride and Black Christmas were properties before he wrote this. The True Bride being an old German folklore tale. So those sorts of things that he just lifted titles from. So one thing he was really good at is getting a marketable title. I do want to read his other real horror story, Dark Places. Dark Places and Black Christmas were his only real horror books. The rest were thriller. But this really does work as a whodunit, work as, like I said, a high stakes thriller horror. It's quite gory. There's bodies everywhere, and that body posing, which is very popular in slasher tropes, like Friday the 13th. There's a lot of body discovery going on in this book, and I highly enjoyed it. I found it was a really good seasonal horror as well. While the other books in this stack of 6, really irreplaceable horror, classic horror greats, all from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think that this one is the least modern of it all, even though it is one of the newer ones out of the stack, right? Aside from Stepford Wives. It really doesn't rely as much on the modern contrivances because people aren't readily using a lot of modernity. There's no sci-fi angles. There isn't even a paranormal angle that is defeated using modern twists. But all the same, I really love the writing in this book. It is the most well written in a way out of a lot of these, even though it is just sort of a formulaic whodunit. In a way, it is written really well, and I wish that I could write that fun of a book, or this powerful of a book, or this modern of a book, or this evil of a book, or this evil of a book, or this evil of a book. I mean, really, we've got a lot of evil books going on here. So are any of these on your Mount Rushmore of classic mid-century modern type horror fiction? Let me know if all of these fit for you, or if there's other books you would swap in or out. Thank you so much for watching, and have an ooky, spooky day.